Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and this week many in the Jewish world are mourning the passing of Rabbi David Hartman, founder of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, a vibrant center of Jewish pluralism that has fostered wonderful scholarship and has been a center where the Jewish tradition grapples with the ethical issues of the day. David Hartman was both a charismatic modern Orthodox rabbi who came out of a very traditional home in Brooklyn. He also was a gifted writer and became a major philosophical thinker in the Jewish world. He was forceful, funny, intellectually demanding, and inclusive in his approach to Torah, the Jewish tradition, and Jewish life. And David Hartman was a profound influence on his friends, his colleagues, and his students, and on me, inspiring us all to grow and become more sensitive and committed to the truths of the rabbinic tradition. A little later in this hour, we'll be playing for you a meeting I had with David Hartman some years ago, and you'll get to hear in his own words how he thought and who he was. And I think you'll get a real sense of how unusual a rabbi and Jewish thinker he was, how he challenged any suggestion that Judaism is fundamentalist, and how he was able to make Judaism more intelligible and accessible for many, many modern Jews. But right now I'd like you to hear from one of David Hartman's colleagues in Jewish leadership, Rabbi Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, the president of the Jewish Life Network as part of the Steinhardt Foundation, and Yitz himself is one of the leading modern Orthodox rabbis who's helping to explain the meaning of Judaism in a modern context.
Well, losing David Hartman is a huge blow. He was really a friend, I guess more accurately, maybe a soulmate. I came to teach at Yeshiva University. I had just gotten my PhD in 1959, and he was there teaching already. He just started teaching a couple of years before me, and it was instant bonding, instant connection, and that's a connection that was nurturing and powerful for 54 years. So I would certainly say, personally, it's a huge loss. I think it was a huge loss for the Jewish people. What makes him so great, or what makes him so special? In 1965, David called me, and he was by then a rabbi in Montreal. A layperson who trusted him, believed in him, gave him a grant of money, said, spend it any way you want to improve Jewish religion, Jewish thought. He called me and said, what do we do? What would you like to do? I said, you know what? I'd like to sit and learn with you because we haven't done this since you left New York, and I really miss you. He said, I'd like to learn with you too, but I have this money. Let's invite every rabbi that we want to talk to or that we have learned from. And we started going through the list, and again, Hartman, we had Orthodox rabbis on the list, but he had and I had conservative Reform rabbis on the list, Emil Fackenheim, Jacob Padachovsky, some of the Gene Borowitz, some of the classic Reform things. They were writing very important stuff. We were very excited by it and conservative. The point is, he said, didn't hesitate, of course. We invited these people, we got together and called it the Canadian Center for Jewish Studies, but the most powerful thing about it was the stunning interaction of the group. I always tell people, it was a turning point in my life. I went for a long walk with Jacob Padachovsky, who was, of course, a major figure at HUC.
Reform movement?
Yeah, in the Reform movement. He said he wants to talk about Jewish divorce law. So first of all, it was an hour-and-a-half walk. I have to say, I apologize, but it's the truth. I assumed Reform rabbis didn't know Jewish divorce law, didn't have this Talmud halachic skills, but of course, he absolutely had it all and knew it all. for an hour and a half. And again, at the end of about an hour, I began to realize, what he's saying not only is correct and true, but that he's right and I'm wrong. That there's a real problem in the Orthodox halacha dealing with get. Now, I can't tell you how many levels that was transformational. First of all, I realized again that I had all wrong and that Reform had, not just him, people of spiritual power, of religious impact, have thought through positions. It's not a question of the easy way, and then with a moral question here in which they were right. And again, multiply it. I mean, Emil Fackenheim had never thought about the Holocaust. He considered history irrelevant, and in this encounter, he became a major figure in this area, and going to go on and on. But that's what Hartman did for me. Two things right in that. One, to create a community of not just Orthodox.
Sorry. Stupid me. I know better.
To create a community.
Hold on 1 second. Let me turn on. Start. Unmute for 1 second and say, that's what Hartman did for me, and keep going.
That's what Hartman did for me, to create a community that was not just Orthodox, but of all the Jewish people. This community marked by profound thought and religious questioning and search and passion for the Jewish people. And that experience was so vivid that it really transformational for all of us. And he did that at the Hartman Institute in Israel for secular as well as Orthodox religious thinkers. He did that for students, for thousands of students. The combination of intellectual force, spiritual search, not taking easy answers, combined with that crossing all lines. He didn't want to hear propaganda. He didn't want you to tell him you agree with him. He would appreciate a student who challenged him and argued with him much more than a student who said, great, because he wanted to grow himself. He wanted to learn.
One of the things that impressed me about him was the extent to which he argued for a non-literalist, non-fundamentalist Judaism. And in my mind, and you'll tell me if I'm fair, I associate you also with that approach. Mm-hmm. Could you speak about that for a moment from your shared perspective? And then I'm going to ask you whether that created problems for him within the larger Orthodox world, as it may for you too, Yitz.
Yeah. No kidding. Well, of course, I have to say this. Hartman is truly modern Orthodox. In fact, one might say a new breed of modern Orthodox. So again, he transcended Orthodoxy because his Judaism was the whole religion, the whole people. He was not denominational, and that's an important part of his message. But having said that, he came from a Hasidic background, studied in very traditional yeshivot, not modern Orthodox, and then came to Yeshiva University, met Rabbi Soloveitchik, met modern Orthodoxy, but even more important than that, he met the modern culture. What he represented was, if you will, this tremendous latent power in the tradition, but which was frankly overlaid by many elements of the past which are counterproductive or questionable or negative, and overlaid by a kind of insularity. He can't function. He was the opposite. He was attracted to the modern. He was moved by it. He was fertilized, inseminated by it to a point where his own thought prospered. So his contribution was not just a non-literal reading, because again, the fundamentalism is literalness. It preserves what was, but it's not credible, in my judgment, not credible for people who are seriously integrated. Hartman understood that, and therefore he interpreted and translated Jewish tradition into the terms and into the conceptual framework that a modern or postmodern person has to be in. And that was a very important contribution, not just for Orthodox Jews. I mean, it was really Reform, we're all wrestling with those questions. And he showed, and by the way, another major personal contribution, he had this marvelous and important point that everybody, secular, religious, Orthodox, Reconstruction, doesn't matter, need to be enriched or challenged by a new encounter with the tradition. Not filtered, not improved, not gussied up and made to look very modern, but in all its density, tension, power, challenge. And he taught us all, that the whole Jewish people, that learning is a way of a unity where we can all come to the text from our different backgrounds, no propaganda, no party line commitments in advance, and you will also be fructified and enriched in a new way. And then that contribution was made across the board, and again, he was perfectly happy and willing to criticize his own positions or the Orthodox positions when they were wrong, as they were, or where they were behind, and issues like women, or some of the moral question. Now, what about modern Orthodoxy? Well, of course, this is one of the great tragedies of modern Orthodoxy. We've lived through a generation of disintegration or of loss of place, loss of way for modern Orthodoxy. What happened really since the 60s, I think they were shocked by how modern or how open or how radical the culture was. They weren't ready for it. So they withdrew, or they were treated into kind of a Haredi psychology. Hartman, by insisting on the opposite, going forward and integrating and learning from this culture, affirming it by his pluralism, by his insistence that Israel, again, crosses all lines, they couldn't handle it. And unfortunately, as part of this retreat, they were retreating when he was advancing. And so what really happened was, in many cases, to dodge, or they couldn't stand up to this, so they basically turned on him or tried to reject him or demean him or delegitimate him. And there's no question that, particularly in yeshiva circles, they denied his orthodoxy or they denied his legitimacy, but the fact is that he had this power of thought, and the truth is, 20, 30 years later, Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy itself, I think had not only hit bottom in terms of this process of retreating and becoming more Haredi, but I think you see grassroots important revival of a search that really comes back to Hartman, mainly to renew the tradition in an affirmative way, in a new relationship to modernity.
Yitz Greenberg, you've been helping us with that search as well, and I thank you for spending a moment with us talking about David Hartman. Thank you. I'd also like you to hear from someone who brings a different perspective to the contribution David Hartman made to Jewish life by speaking to one of his students.
One of the things that I think were unique, or what attracted people to David Hartman, was the fact that while there are many people who espouse and, so to speak, preach pluralism, David's unique contribution is the fact that he brought his entire background to bear on this conversation. I wrote a piece for one of our institution's newsletters, and what I pointed out is that David actually went through a very interesting trajectory in terms of his own education. He had a very traditional, so to speak, Haredi yeshiva education, then went to Yeshiva University where he got his smicha, and eventually ended up in, I think, either Penn State or University of Fordham, where he got his doctorate in philosophy. And I think that's what made David so unique, that David was able to argue for his beliefs and his values as an insider, someone who really knew the tradition very well, and in a simple sense of the word, was a real Talmid Chacham. He really knew Torah, knew Talmud, knew Halacha, and as much as he said otherwise, he said yeshiva boy all his life. That love for Torah, that passion for learning, and that commitment for learning stay with him all the time. And that's one of the things that I found incredibly attractive about him. That as someone who myself went through the traditional yeshiva experience, there was a yeshiva bachar in him that stayed all the time. But that's what made his message so attractive. He really was able to quote for you chapter and verse, when he made an argument, whether it was for pluralism, whether it's for inclusiveness, whether it's for openness, he was really ready to roll out for you the tradition, and whether that was Talmud, whether that was medieval commentators, traditionally referred to as the Rishonim, whether it was Halacha, whether it was Poskim, whether it was more contemporary Shutim, he was able to do that, and I think that answers the second half of your question, that There was, of course, a segment within the Orthodox community that dismissed him, just easily dismissed him because what he said was anathema to their beliefs and to their values. But at the same time, there was a significant segment who found him very challenging. And found him very challenging precisely because of what I said, because it's easy to dismiss someone who makes arguments for a more modern and a more inclusive Judaism, but bases those arguments from sources that are far into the tradition. But with David Hartman, that was much harder. David Hartman was an insider. David Hartman was part of the system, and David Hartman posed a huge challenge. So at least the people that I know, either were attracted to him or at a minimum had to grapple with his theology and his philosophy.
You literally studied with him.
Yes, yes.
What was he like? And look, his personal life is his personal life. I'm asking you, what was it like to be a student of David Hartman?
Yes. Not a simple experience. But not a simple experience to study with David.
What was the best part of it?
See, it's interesting. A lecture with David was not just a lecture. It was a performance. Sitting with David for an hour and a half, you left and you felt, wow, that was fascinating. Now, fascinating can mean a lot of things. Fascinating can mean incredibly insightful, incredibly challenging, or it can oftentimes also mean infuriating. David had a very complex personality. He was not...
Was it both?
It was almost always both. Hartman gave me the language to talk about an ancient text that was written, I don't know, roughly sometime between 50 BC to 150 CE in very contemporary terms. Hartman was able to pick, out of the 2,500 pages of Talmud. My experience over learning and studying with David for so many years is that you would just be able to go over to the bookcase, with the bookshelf, pick out any tractate, any Masechet, and open it up, sit down with David for an hour and go through it, and all of a sudden, those archaic and ancient terms and assumptions and terminology became contemporary. And like I said, that was unique to David because within the progressive Jewish community, there aren't that many people who have that level of knowledge and depth when it comes to traditional classic texts, and that was incredibly exciting for me.
And now that's what you try to do.
As best as I can, I don't know if I can imitate David exactly, but clearly it was a model that was very inspiring, very helpful, and I think for the Orthodox community, extremely relevant and important. My suspicion is it's going to take time for people to really start appreciating the secondary contribution that David made, because people talk more about the obvious, the books that he wrote, the essays, but in terms of his persona and who he was and how his own background and going from yeshiva to modern orthodoxy to a secular university, and how that blend combined made who he was and his Torah unique and incredibly relevant.
Well, I had limited personal contact with him. Okay. My own contact with him, he was just lovely as lovely can be. And there were messages that I got from him. And I always felt because they came from someone with his background, they had an authoritativeness that was very wonderful for those of us who were not coming from the Orthodox world to begin with. And it's interesting, we could talk separately about how the Jewish community does or does not assimilate and absorb information based on who the teacher is, even if the teacher is saying the same thing.
Right.
But he had a yichus to him, an intellectual yichus, that gave him the right to say certain things in a very powerful way. And one of the things he stressed in my contact with him was the extent to which fundamentalism was not a part of the essential Talmudic perspective. Right. To what extent are you comfortable with that, with his articulation of that? And is that one of the contributions he made that hopefully will be lasting within the Jewish academic world?
Yeah, I think that was part of his contribution, no doubt, and he was vociferous in the way he fought Jewish fundamentalism. And I don't know for sure. I mean, my suspicion is that is something that became more prevalent when he came to Israel and where he encountered that fundamentalism in a very practical way. I mean, something that David Hartman talked about a lot is the difference between what he called Torah Chutz La'aretz and Torah Eretz Yisrael, where in Israel it's real. You know, what you think and what you believe actually has impact in the public square.
Yes, the nature of Judaism in the land of
exactly,
Israel and outside the land
outside
of Israel.
Right, exactly. So for him, that was something that he really took on very strongly. And again, he was able to talk the fundamentalist language.
He was very influenced, by the way, by Rav Soloveitchik. And to hear Hartman describe it, he felt that he was being authentic to a line that traced back to Soloveitchik all the way back to the Rambam, Maimonides. Do you feel, first of all, that I've got it right? That's how he explained it. And then the second thing is, do you think Hartman was right?
What's the difference?
Is Hartman right to say that the expression, interpretation, and presentation of the Talmudic perspective that he received from Rav Soloveitchik, and which he claims traces back to Maimonides, do you feel that he's historically correct?
Right. So it's interesting because I was going to say, as a follow-up to your question about his contribution in terms of pushing back against Jewish fundamentalism, that I think equally important, if not more so, and the only reason I'm saying more so is because the fight against fundamentalism is not unique to David. Others have taken out as well. But equally important, if not more important, contribution is exactly what you were pointing to, which is David made the following argument. David said, granted, over the course of many years, Judaism has moved from biblical Judaism, Talmudic Judaism in broad outlines, the medieval period, and then we've reached the kind of early modern period, which kind of primarily starts with the codification of Jewish law. David felt that the fundamental mistake that Orthodox Judaism made was to allow halakha to supersede everything that came before, instead of seeing halakha as complementary to what came before. And in that, he was incredibly, incredibly important in the sense that the fact that halakha came on the scene does not mean that we should now ignore what the Talmud does. And one of the most amazing things that David was able to argue is halakha is definitive. Halakha is final, and when we talk about Jewish law, then we need to have a single voice, so to speak, a winning side. David said that might be true behaviorally in terms of the basic question of Jewish law and Jewish practice. You might say, okay, do I take this kind of etrog on Sukkot or that kind of etrog? But that doesn't mean that we should lose the earlier tradition, which is the tradition of the Talmud, where there's a multiplicity of voices, multiplicity of possibilities, and these two, David argued convincingly, can live in tandem, side by side. So I think, yeah, you're 100% correct that David's argument was that we forgot the hundreds of years that came before the finalization or the codification of Jewish practice. And in other words, David said, maybe practice might have been codified. Belief has never been codified. Mm-hmm. And there's a multiplicity within the tradition. And yeah, there's no doubt that he is 100% convincing. The one thing that I would qualify in terms of your articulation of David's philosophy is that his relationship with Rav Soloveitchik was complex. There were areas where he agreed with Rav and areas where he disagreed. Some of you have heard the famous story that says over about the story with the plane.
No, tell me.
Yeah, so the beautiful story that he loved to repeat. He was a raconteur on top of everything else. He loved to say stories, and he had this kind of childlike appreciation for a funny story or a funny quip. So the story he tells is that he was at YU studying at Yeshiva University, a student of Rav Soloveitchik, and then he decided to go study philosophy at Fordham. And he was a little nervous, At the end of the day, he was a from yeshiva boy, and studying philosophy can have, consequences. So he goes to the Rav and says, sheepishly, I'm thinking of studying philosophy. but I'm a little bit nervous because I know that people before me have studied philosophy and they have left their tradition. And Rav Soloveitchik looks at him and says, David, planes have crashed before. Does that mean that people stop flying on planes? And David Hartman repeats that story, pauses for a few minutes, says, I went to Fordham, and years later I called the Rav and said, guess what? The plane crashed.
The plane crashed.
The plane crashed. So and he loved to say that story, But of course, as jokes go, it was half true.
Yes.
The plane crashed, but I think he picked up the pieces. And his life story was basically trying to reconstitute that plane in a way that it could survive the turbulence of modernity.
That's beautifully said.
So.
And that is, in many ways, the contribution he has made. And look, I understand the audience that is listening to us right now, they have not, it's almost like we're talking on too philosophical a level or too detailed a level for a lay television audience. But at the same time, I'm hoping that there are some people watching us right now who just are interested in how this extraordinary, unique rabbinic presence it did influence, and part of the influence is raising questions. Raise questions which we now grapple with. And he also, I'll see if you agree with me, in some way he gave permission to a certain kind of questioning within the Jewish tradition, so that if you are searching in a certain way, you can feel at home within the Orthodox or traditional Jewish mindset, and not feel that you have in some way gone on a plane that crashed.
Right.
So that his plane may have crashed, and it is a great story. But in some way, he helped many of us to fly. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, totally. And again, going back to what I said earlier, David again was unique in the sense that he showed you how those questions are deeply felt. These were not abstract questions that people discuss, over tea. These are questions that bug you, that upset you, that challenge you, and the funny thing about David is you look at him and you see how frustrated he is with some of the conventional, manifestations of Orthodoxy, and you would think that he would just leave. And well, if it's so bad, then why don't you just leave? But he never wanted to leave, never wanted to kind of abandon it, because he felt very comfortable at that, but at the same time was able to ask questions exactly as you said. But I can't think of that many people like him who are honest and open in the sense that they are willing to show you how deeply felt those questions are, how angry he would get. That was like a religious fury.
Yes, this was serious stuff. This was important to him.
Right, exactly.
And he felt it should be important to all of us.
Right.
Yes?
Right, totally.
One thing I also want you to comment on, and I'm going to be very interested in your answer, his very last book, From Defender to Critic. And I felt there was a change. If the story about the plane that he tells, I would have expected him almost to not tell the story till that book, because I felt in some way he had crossed the line. And maybe I'm wrong. I want to hear
the line, how so?
I felt, again, he went from defender of the tradition. He wanted to say, I am now a critic of it in a different way. There's a difference between being somebody who asks questions and someone who is a critic. And when I read that book, I felt that the commitment he had that sort of kept him within a certain boundary, he couldn't stay there any longer. Right. And I almost said to myself, this is not a book by an Orthodox rabbi anymore. I always felt up till that book, he was an Orthodox rabbi who in fact was saying what you said. There is a dialectic in the Talmudic process which halakha does not reflect. Don't ever let go of that dialectic, that, elu ve'elu, right? That both sides of an argument can be expressing the words of the living God. Don't take the other guy and dismiss him. And he also was very open with the Jew who questioned the existence of God, who was struggling with whether there is a God or not, and he wanted you to come to the synagogue, to the shul, even if you weren't sure.
Right.
But then when I read Defender and Critic, I'm just giving you my personal reaction,
Sure.
I felt all of a sudden whatever struggle he had pushed him outside a boundary,
Right.
and that he was now standing, that what he was writing now could have been written by a very committed conservative thinker, rabbi, scholar, not an Orthodox rabbi, scholar.
Right.
How fair is this analysis of him?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'll say two things. Number one, we've been kind of talking about the wonderful contribution that David Hartman has made to Jewish thinking and Jewish philosophy. He was a complex person. He was a very complex person, a very complex personality, and to reuse a outdated cliche or a worn-out cliche, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, and David was not consistent. But I'll do a Hartman on David Hartman that, posthumously, now that David has passed on, we shouldn't be bound by the chronology of his books. David's contribution is the mixture of all the books existing there in tandem, side by side, and allowing us to engage in that conversation. And, David Hartman, if someone would ask David that question about someone else, David would say, the fact that he published the last book last doesn't necessarily mean that it's his final word. It is one voice within the David Hartman,
That's wonderful.
oeuvre, and I think that's the truth. And who knows, if David lived 15 more years, he might have written another book that would have brought him back, because David Hartman did not necessarily insist on consistency. That was not one of his weaknesses. So yeah, I agree that book was a phase in David's thinking, but that doesn't mean that the next morning he could have said something completely different. So I hope I salvaged David for you somewhat.
You did very well. You did very well. And it's not that he needs to be salvaged by me.
No, I
just found it a
understand.
very
Yes.
interesting
Yes.
transition and progression in a man's work.
Yeah, for sure.
One more comment. Give us, 60 seconds on the Shalom Hartman Institute and its role in Jewish life today, this incredible pluralistic institution which does not call itself Orthodox.
Right.
And out of that institution, the Shalom Hartman Institute, are coming some fabulous things. Try to put that into perspective for us.
Yeah, maybe I'm a little biased, but once again, David identified an aspect within Judaism that transcends denomination, that transcends difference, and that is the Talmud. David said, yeah, there might be arenas where we disagree, and maybe on Shabbat we might not daven in the same shul. I don't want a shul. I do not want a shul. I want a Beit Midrash, because the text of the Talmud transcends history, transcends denomination, transcends difference. And I'm sure you know it as well as I, because I'm assuming you've been to the Hartman Beit Midrash. It is a phenomenal success.
It is.
You walk into that Beit Midrash, and really the entire spectrum of Judaism, or the world, frankly, not just Jews, because there were people non-Jews who were invited quite often as well. It was an arena where he believed the arena of the Jewish textual tradition that transcends differences, that is an area where we have so much in common that we can grow. And he really built an institution that I would say is almost like a Beit Mikdash for ideas. It's really where ideas are sacred, ideas are important, ideas matter, and it's really a vibrant place for the discussion of ideas, and where scholars are revered in a real way. And whether you study mysticism on the one end or Spinoza on the other hand and everything in the middle, you're just part of that conversation. And it is just a beautiful testament, a beautiful memorial to what David Hartman was and what David Hartman believed.
Ysoscher Katz, this is the first time we've met. You're fabulous.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad the audience has had a chance to meet you, and I've had a chance to meet you. And I can only imagine that you're a wonderful, wonderful teacher yourself.
Thank you.
And I want you to do more on Shalom TV and be
Sure.
more with our audience.
I would be more than happy.
Thank you
Thank
very
you very
much for
much.
giving us a real insight
Thank
into
you.
David Hartman. You're wonderful.
Thank you. Toda rabba.
But the best way to really get a feel for David Hartman is to hear him himself. And so what I want to do now is play for you this extraordinary meeting I was privileged to have with him. But it's many years ago. You'll notice I'm not the same, and he was much younger, but so what? His voice on this particular interview, this time together, is one of my most precious moments of all the things I've ever done on L'chaim. And some of the things he says, especially as you're about to hear about his railing against, although in a very lovely way, the mistake any Jew would make to think that you've got the truth in your pocket, and how the Jewish tradition is not literalist or a fundamentalist, and how one must be open to embracing the entire spectrum of Jewish thought and the extraordinary world in which we live. That, for me, was a lesson that I learned very young in my rabbinic career from David Hartman, and it's one of the reasons why I have loved him very, very much. It's an honor for me to share with you now my sitting with David Hartman back in the early 1990s on L'chaim. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
First of all, a question about the Shalom Hartman Institute. You really should have the opportunity to explain to the L'chaim audience, what is the Shalom Hartman Institute? How did it get its name? And what are you trying to do with it in Jerusalem?
Well, its name comes from my father, who was born in Jerusalem and was a Jerusalemite Jew from generation and generation. And I felt that the best way to pay tribute to his memory was to found an institute and in his spirit, which was a spirit of joy in terms of Judaism. His Judaism was not a Judaism of fanaticism. His Judaism was not nurtured by delegitimizing those who were different from himself. It was a Judaism that sprung from the well springs of long classical orthodoxy, which nurtured itself by joy, by love, by learning, and by commitment.
You've used the word joy twice in connection to your father. Most sons don't use that word. Why joy?
Because that was the thing that he specialized in. I mean, he was terribly poor. He wasn't an enormously learned person. He became an orphan at 12 and had to go support his family in Jerusalem. But what he did have was the Hasidic fervor of dancing with the Torah and Simchas Torah, and he would take a synagogue of old Jews who didn't dance for 40 years, and suddenly they would really be a discotheque going and a really vital framework. And he was able to generate that type of enthusiasm by his spirit, by his love, by his commitment and concern. And so he communicated, together with my mother, Alav Shalom, of blessed memory, who passed away within the last 2 years. They built a home with children who studied. We didn't have furniture, but we bought books. Mm-hmm. My father never asked, or my mother never asked us to go to work to support the family. They felt that the best thing that we can do is to learn.
Brothers and sisters?
Yes, there were 4 brothers, 2 passed away, and 2 sisters. And my older brother, who was the significant figure of the family, Yecheskel Hartman, created the sense of intellectual excellence, of the yearning to master Talmud. Anyway, the home was a home in which I didn't feel that piety needs an object to hate. Mm-hmm. In other words, that I felt close to God without saying, I don't like him, or I don't go in his shul, or I won't eat with him, or I won't eat in that person's house. And I never felt piety through negation and anger. So piety was a result of an internal conviction. Piety was a result of joy. Piety was a result of growth of learning. That was the orthodoxy I knew, and that's the orthodoxy I love, and that's why I say I'm still an Orthodox rabbi. It's not the orthodoxy I see today. It's not the climate I see in Jerusalem. nor is it the climate I see in America. I mean, I don't understand what happened suddenly to the healthy spirit of Torah learning which pervaded once very pious Jewish communities. And I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, New York, and Bundists were there, communists were there, and every form of Jew found his way, and people talked to each other. And there was, no one needed to sort of create Jewish ecumenism because they never thought that Jews couldn't talk to each other.
Now, are you suggesting that as David Hartman grew up, that in general, this kind of openness within facets of the Jewish community was
the norm?
It was the norm?
It was the norm.
Harmony was the norm, David?
Not harmony. Jews never had harmony. I mean, but they learned how to respectfully disagree. They listened to each other's arguments. They felt the need to discuss things with each other. They felt the need to disagree with each other. But they didn't feel a need to exclude from the community. There wasn't this rabid type of, he's outside and the inside. You see. There was not a person there was no Madame Lafarge's, doing some investigation on racist purity or doctrinal orthodoxy. It wasn't that climate. People learned. I never knew what the word heretic meant. I never heard that growing up in a very serious religious climate.
Very interesting for me.
Now that was not, and therefore this climate that I grew up in was fed equally as well by an American spirit of pluralism, of playing basketball with the blacks and Italians in Lincoln Terrace Park.
You played basketball, David?
A little bit, yes. I was known for the only yeshiva boy who played basketball with Bob Cousy. In other words, for me, Jerusalem, I didn't want to sort of go native when I came to America, to Jerusalem. Yeah, when I landed in Lud, I didn't throw away the American Constitution, nor did I throw away the whole values of democracy, freedom of conscience, which I loved in America. The respect for minorities, the respect for differences, religious freedom, that people should choose religion on the basis of choice rather than coercion. All those values of America I loved as an Orthodox Jew, you see.
You know, you are often referred to as the modern Jewish theologian and philosopher. May I ask you a question or two about God? And may I ask it to you from the perspective of the average, ordinary Jew who is questing and searching for meaning in his Jewish or her Jewish tradition in the midst of a modern context. And very often when people use the word philosopher and theologian, right away they are intimidated. They assume the answer is going to be
abstruse,
yes,
unintelligible,
or so involved and so difficult to follow that it scares them off. And I know that what you always try to do is simply speak to the soul and the heart and the mind of the Jew. For you, God is very real, correct?
Correct.
When you say that God is real, and you've discussed in all various contexts how you are not a fundamentalist reader of the Torah, I'm assuming that you do not mean that you imagine God as person. But I don't want to lead you. Is God a person?
He's experienced as a person.
Does God have a body?
According to Maimonides, no.
How about according to David Hartman?
I really...
Are you comfortable with Maimonides' answer?
Yes. I'm comfortable with Maimonides' approach that says you could only say what God is not, never what he is. I think in that sense, what he's really saying is that we never have a theology. We never have a final truth about the nature of God. What we have about God is living witnesses who describe how they live with God. Now, I never have direct access to the reality of God independent of these mediating witnesses, and therefore I have taken a different stance than Buber or than Heschel. I believe you begin with the God of the fathers before you come to say my God. Heschel in God in Search of Man wanted very much to help this generation have a direct access to the experience of divinity, the sense of wonder. Buber spoke of an unmediated form of spirituality. I believe the task is first to begin through listening. I once told persons in my congregation who said to me, I said, Harry, why don't you come to synagogue? He was a doctor, a very fine man. He says, David, I don't believe in God. I said, Harry, I want you to know I don't believe in God either. He says, you? But you're a rabbi. I mean, you're paid to believe. I mean, that's what your salary's about. And I said, I want you to understand that the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. That's very important. Now, the question is, what do we mean by the God you believe in and the God you don't believe in? And I told him, come to synagogue. Come to learn if you can't pray. So he came for a year. And he used to come close to the sermon and he'd feel comfortable. But then he said he wanted to come a little longer. But he said he has difficulty praying. And I said, well, instead of thinking that when you open up the prayer book that you're praying, why don't you look upon the prayer book as someone that's listening to the way others prayed? And it's not an expression of your own convictions because you don't have a clarity about what your convictions are. But what you're doing when you're reading the prayer book is trying to listen to the way Jews prayed for years.
That's very beautiful, David.
Now, for me, it is extremely important that we begin as listeners.
Does God intervene in nature and in human events?
There have been Jews who thought that way. And the Bible bears witness to a certain sense of intervention. And they understood their liberation story through God's direct intervention. Now, for example, take the concept of miracle. I once argued with a Reconstructionist on Kaplan's supernaturalism, how can we believe in miracles, etc. Now, if you look upon miracles as in some way God just breaking into history and changing the whole world and upside down, that's one way. And it's one way of talking about it, and it's an intelligent way of talking about it. But if you say, wait a second, I don't want to focus on the metaphysical truth question of miracle. I don't want to ask, how does it work in nature? What does it mean to people when they live in a culture that tells the stories about miracles?
Yes.
What do we mean when we tell our young people and we tell ourselves the miracle of the liberation from Egypt, the miracle of the Exodus? We use this language of miracle. The Scud missiles that came to Israel, miracles. Everything is miracles. You know, I mean, miracles means a people's ability to live with surprise. Miracle means a person who doesn't say, well, I met you yesterday, so therefore I know everything about you. A person who's always willing to learn something new from new adventures of experience. A father who's prepared to say to his child, in other words, remember, parents, the worst thing they can do to their children, say, I know you. Or you're just like your Uncle Joe, and therefore I know you. In other words, the worst thing that lovers can give each other is to say, I really know you. And love is to be perpetually open to surprise and new knowledge. That's miracle. The future could be different than the past.
By the way, you bring instinctively a midrashic approach to Jewish thought, don't you?
Well, I bring, and I think Judaism survived because it allowed for interpretive boldness of the text. The word was not a frozen word. It was a word that was heard. And what's beautiful for me as a Jewish philosopher is I see the way Jews heard the word so differently in different generations. Each generation has to receive the Torah in its time. There's the eternal voice that comes out of Sinai, but it's heard very differently in every different generation. And therefore one must renew the interpretive boldness that has always existed in. And we've never been fundamentalists, we've never been literalists. That's the meaning of the Talmudic tradition. Anyone has to read the Bible and look at the rabbis and the Talmud and see what they do with the text. Fundamentalism is grounded in ignorance, in the false need for feeling I got the final word, I don't have to think anymore, I can now go to sleep because the truth is in my pocket. If you go to sleep because the truth is in your pocket, that's the best way to lose it. I mean, when Hillel and Shammai argue with each other, who is right? And God answers, they're both right. Mm-hmm. So if they're both right, you've destroyed for me absolute truth and certainty. But the law is according to Hillel.
Yes.
And the reason why the law is according to Hillel, because he always brings the opinion of Shammai before he brings his own opinion. So I said, he's got the Man of the Year award, because he's nice and he has manners and he brings Shammai before himself. That's why the law was according to, no. I said, the law was according to Hillel because he understood that Shammai's position was also possible. The law is only according to a person who knows that legal arguments never give you absolute truth. They only give you plausibility. They only give you reasonableness. They give you an opportunity to think, gee, this is a reasonable way of interpreting it, but doesn't mean that there isn't an alternative way of interpreting it.
Must a Jew believe in God?
I would say a Jew has to live constantly with the question, what do I have to believe in God or not?
He must live with the question.
That's correct. And
It has to matter to him.
It has to matter.
It has
to
to
him.
matter.
Like, I don't know, one of the biggest problems that I feel is that nothing matters. The only thing that matters is if you contribute to the UJA. In other words, all heresies are legitimate except the campaign. In other words, I don't want the campaign to be the new Judaism, although I think it's very important to contribute to the campaign. In other words, I would like Jews to be engaged in a Torah discussion. I would like Jews to think about, not only Jews, all human beings, to think about what's the meaning of idolatry. That's the bigger question. Not who is God, but what is a false God?
Understand. So what in a modern Orthodox context does it mean for you to say the law is Torah Misinai, that it is from God in detail?
Yeah, so the law is from Sinai means that's the founding moment. The founding moment occurs at Sinai. It's not the last moment. See, Torah from Sinai doesn't mean that everything was already given. It means that the founding moment is there. The directional framework is there. The frame of reference is there. Now it has to be filled in by an interpretive community constantly applying it to their lives.
By an interpretive community. So human beings, Jews, are part of this process.
Absolutely. If anyone wants Torah without human beings' input in it, then he might as well give up Judaism. Because Judaism is the living people's interpretive experience through generations, which is the shaper of Torah. Torah is not the literal Bible of Sinai, it is the Talmud, the Midrash, Maimonides, and all the generation of scholars who have gone from then on. And without that interpretive community mediating for me the Word of God, then I don't have Judaism. I have some fundamentalist literalism, which was never Judaism.
Literalism, fundamentalist literalism, was never Judaism.
That's correct.
I want you to speak one more moment about that, because you know, David, there are many, not only non-Orthodox Jews, but there are many Orthodox Jews who really believe that the ultimate expression of Judaism is some form of literal Torah Misinai, in which the Torah was given once and for all, and what we basically do is understand it better as time goes by, but your willingness to inject the human partner in the development of Torah is something which I find so enriching to hear. Speak one more moment about why the Jew loses if the Jew believes it was given once and for all.
You see, the point is that the Torah was given at Sinai, or Jews believe the Torah was given at Sinai, as the eternal quest. In other words, that here is a frame of reference that I have to constantly renew and recreate. That in that moment lies the possibility of infinite capacities of development and growth. Now, the living testimony that this word could take on many faces is the fact that Jews have been interpreting it. The richness of Torah. In other words, I always say that the final chapter of Torah has not yet been written. And that's the meaning of the oral tradition. There is no final book and chapter. And therefore the only thing, that's why I disagree with Spinoza. In other words, Jews were not only asked to be obedient, they were asked to be intellectually creative. And my own teacher writes a whole book, The Halachic Man, in which he celebrates creativity and autonomy and the innovative spirit of the Talmudic mind. And therefore, for me, piety is not ignorant obedience. Lo am haaretz chasid. The one who is ignorant cannot be pious in the Jewish tradition. And therefore, learning. Now, what does learning mean? Not rote memory. Anyone who learned in a Talmudic yeshiva knew a chidush, to say a new thought, to say something that your Rebbe didn't think of, to come to something that the past didn't think of, was a sign of great spiritual joy. And therefore, I believe deeply in the tradition is the respect for human creativity. Now, I've often given examples in my book, A Living Covenant. If I study my teacher's lectures on Talmud, in the morning when I wake up, do I make a blessing over Torah? Do I say, blessed art thou, our God, King of the universe, who made us holy with his commandment and commanded us to be engaged in the words of Torah? And then I open up Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings. Have I made a blessing in vain, or do I have to read Moses' writings?
Obviously, you have not made a blessing in vain.
Because what he has written is part of Torah. What human beings create is part of Torah. That's the meaning of covenant. We are not just passive recipients. We are creators in the ongoing drama of what the Torah is to become. We are responsible for what we make of this tradition. We are not, no one can hide behind saying, well, what can I do? The tradition forces me. The tradition doesn't force you. You acquiesce because you have refused to discover if the tradition can, in a sense, accommodate new innovative boldness. If it can't, that's a different question. But you have to push to the limits its possibilities.
And so on Shavuot, does David Hartman feel himself standing at the foot of Sinai?
Absolutely.
And what's it feel like?
I want to tell you, sometimes it's lonely. It's lonely because I sometimes feel that what I'm listening to, many Jews find difficult to hear. And I'm looking for other Jews to stand with in Sinai, for them to appreciate the invitation and the joy on the part of God for me to become responsible. God doesn't want me a child. He doesn't want me to stand there frightened, intimidated by him. I feel he smiles and laughs and is enjoying my joy.
And so don't tell me, tell them that moment of Shavuot, at that moment of
When
Sinai.
he's listening to he should appreciate the fact that Moses heard God's prayer. On Shavuot, he should listen to the way Moses listened to God's dream that Israel should be a holy people. They should be, not that they are. It's not a racist triumphalism. He should hear the challenge. He should hear that to be a spiritual person is to not be frightened of responsibility, to feel commanded, that to begin one's life out of a sense of duty. And not just, well, I feel like it, but no, I'm obligated. A sense of command, that the language of mitzvah should speak to him, and that God can never be seen, only heard. Shema Yisrael, hear Israel. And in the hearing of the commandment, you make God real to your life. And Shavuos is an invitation to meet a God who's never seen, but always heard.
Well, David Hartman, you know I love you very much, and it is a very special joy, and not only a special joy, I know how busy you are, and I know when you're in the United States, you're working very, very hard, and you've got a very limited amount of time. And the fact that you would sit with our L'chaim community and share what I consider to be a very special wisdom and a very special kindness and a very special love is very, very wonderful of you. And I will continue to chase you, whether I'm in Jerusalem or whether you're here in the United States, that I am able to make sure as many people as possible have a chance to learn from you. I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha in all of your work. I hope the Shalom Hartman Institute becomes not only a center of learning in Jerusalem, but a center of learning for all the Jewish people, if not all humanity. And I hope that there are people who are meeting you through L'chaim who will make a special point when they're in Jerusalem of going to the Shalom Hartman Institute. And I hope that whenever you are near me, you will have the time to sit in that chair and share more wisdom with the Jewish community. Thank you very, very much. You're a very special man. David Hartman, Orthodox rabbi, founder of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, author, thinker, and a major voice for good in the Jewish world. I hope you have a better sense of who he was and how he enriched all of us. I will miss David Hartman very much. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub, L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.